An unexpected encounter. Nestled amid rolling hills and endless fields of swaying golden corn, Cedar View appeared, at first glance, as idyllic as a postcard. A church steeple, its bells tolling at the top of each hour, stood as the town's sentinel. Its brick-paved main street was lined with mom-and-pop stores, and the familiar faces of its tight-knit residents gave it the appearance of a place untouched by time. Yet, the tranquility of Cedar View was a veneer, concealing decades of deep-seated prejudice and a justice system that had long been tainted by bias. For the black community, Cedar View was a gauntlet. They were fewer in number and louder in whispers, a community forced to live on the periphery of fairness, where every interaction with authority could feel like a gamble with unseen odds. This was the reality Jessica Simpson was stepping into. Appointed as the first black, female police chief in the town's history, Jessica knew her mere presence was a challenge to Cedar View's unspoken rules. But she had never been one to back down. Born in a struggling Chicago neighborhood, she was the daughter of a factory worker father and a mother who took on odd jobs to make ends meet. Jessica's earliest lessons were learned not in a classroom but around a small dinner table where stories of resilience were passed down like heirlooms. Her father, once falsely accused of shoplifting, became the first person to teach her about injustice. His face, a mix of shame and quiet defiance as he explained the ordeal to his children, had been etched into Jessica's memory ever since. It was not just her father's struggle that shaped her. Growing up, Jessica saw police officers who abused their authority, but she also saw officers who stood tall and honorable in their duties. She wanted to be the latter, a protector, a voice of fairness. The journey had been anything but smooth. As a black woman in law enforcement, she had faced double the scrutiny and half the encouragement of her peers. Yet, through sheer grit, Jessica had risen through the ranks. By the time she was appointed as Cedar View's chief of police, she was already a decorated officer known for solving complex cases and fostering community trust. Jessica's arrival in Cedar View, however, was not heralded with celebration. Whispers followed her through the precinct hallways during her initial visits, skepticism brewing among the veteran officers. Some dismissed her as an outsider, while others seemed more fixated on her race and gender than her qualifications. It was clear that she would need to prove herself, and not just once, but every single day. Her first morning on the job, Jessica set out early. Driving a sleek black SUV, she navigated the unfamiliar roads, fields stretching endlessly on either side. Her mind was a whirl of determination and strategy. She knew that systemic change wouldn't come easily. Her task wasn't just to lead, it was to reform. To dismantle long-standing biases entrenched in the force and to bridge the chasm of distrust between the police and the community. The rising sun painted the horizon with hues of orange and pink as Jessica approached Cedar View's outskirts. Her thoughts were disrupted by the sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. A siren wailed briefly before the patrol car behind her signaled for her to pull over. Her grip on the steering wheel tightened. She had been through this before, too many times, in fact. Yet, today, the situation was different. Today, she was the chief of police. Jessica pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath her tires. The siren cut off, leaving an eerie stillness broken only by the faint rustle of the wind. She watched as two officers emerged from the patrol car. One was older, his face stern and unreadable, his gait deliberate and measured. The other was younger, his expression a mixture of suspicion and authority, his eyes scanning her vehicle like a predator assessing its prey. "Good morning, ma'am," the older officer said, his voice clipped and professional. "License and registration, please." Jessica didn't respond immediately. She took a moment to study the man's face, noting the sharp creases in his brow and the subtle weight of his posture. Then, with practiced calm, she reached into the glove compartment and handed over her documents. "May I ask why I've been stopped?" she inquired, her voice steady but firm. The younger officer stepped closer, his hand resting on the notepad clipped to his belt. His gaze flickered between Jessica and the interior of her car. "This vehicle looks a bit out of place for these parts," he said, his tone carrying an edge of condescension. "Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Jessica met his gaze, her expression impassive. She had encountered this type before, officers who wielded authority like a weapon rather than a shield. "I'm on my way to work," she replied, keeping her answer deliberately vague. The older officer, now inspecting her documents, furrowed his brow. He exchanged a glance with his partner, a silent communication passing between them. "We'll need to check a few things," he said finally, his tone neither friendly nor hostile. The younger officer took a step back, motioning for Jessica to remain in her car. "We'll need a closer look," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. It was clear he wasn't asking. Jessica leaned back slightly, her grip on the steering wheel relaxing but her mind sharpening. She had seen this play out before, the probing questions, the implied guilt, the thinly veiled intimidation. This wasn't about a traffic violation or a genuine concern for safety. This was about power, about a system that had long thrived on the unchecked authority of those who wore the badge. "I've provided you with everything you need," Jessica said, her tone unwavering. "If there's an issue, I'd appreciate it if you could explain it." The younger officer's smirk faltered, but only slightly. He opened his notepad, scribbling something down with exaggerated deliberation. "Just routine," he muttered, though his actions suggested otherwise. Jessica felt a flicker of irritation but quickly suppressed it. This was a test, she realized, a microcosm of the challenges she would face as chief. She could reveal her identity, end the encounter, and watch the officers scramble to apologize. But something in her resisted the easy way out. If she wanted to lead this department, she needed to understand its culture, its strengths, its weaknesses, and the attitudes that had festered unchecked for far too long. The older officer returned to her window, handing back her documents with a curt nod. "Everything seems to be in order," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely pleased about it. The younger officer lingered for a moment, his expression still skeptical. "Drive safely," he said, his words clipped but his eyes searching for some final sign of wrongdoing. As Jessica drove away, her mind churned with thoughts. This wasn't just an encounter, it was a glimpse into the culture she was about to inherit. The officers hadn't recognized her, and in a way, she was glad. It gave her an unfiltered view of the challenges ahead. By the time Jessica arrived at the station, her resolve had only deepened. Cedar View wasn't just a town, it was a battleground. And she was ready to fight. The weight of the badge. The morning sun climbed higher into the sky, casting long shadows over the red-bricked facade of Cedar View Police Department. Jessica Simpson parked her SUV in a reserved spot labeled Chief of Police. The faded white letters barely stood out against the asphalt, a testament to how little the town invested in acknowledging its leadership roles. As she stepped out, the weight of her new responsibility settled on her shoulders like an invisible cloak. Today was not just her first day in office, it was the beginning of what she already knew would be an uphill battle. Inside the building, a low hum of activity filled the air. Officers moved purposefully through the narrow hallways, their voices a blend of clipped orders and casual banter. Jessica's entrance caused a ripple effect. Conversations tapered off, heads turned, and the buzz of movement slowed as if someone had hit pause. She could feel the eyes on her, scanning her from head to toe, assessing, judging. Jessica had experienced this before, entering male-dominated spaces where her authority was questioned before she even opened her mouth. But this time, there was something different. Here in Cedar View, the skepticism wasn't just about her gender or the color of her skin. It was also about what she represented, change. And change, Jessica knew, was rarely welcomed with open arms. "Morning, Chief," a voice called out, breaking the awkward silence. Jessica turned to see a woman in her late 20s with auburn hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. She was seated at the front desk, her crisp uniform adorned with a nameplate that read Officer Melanie Ortiz. Good morning, Jessica replied, her voice steady, offering a polite nod. Melanie's face lit up with a smile, a rare moment of warmth in an otherwise chilly reception. Jessica made a mental note of the gesture. Allies, no matter how small the act, were invaluable in an environment like this. Everyone's waiting for you in the conference room, Chief, Melanie added, motioning toward a hallway on the right. Jessica adjusted her blazer, took a deep breath, and walked toward the room. The click of her heels echoed off the tiled floor, the sound carrying a confidence she felt determined to project, even if doubt lingered beneath. As she pushed open the door to the conference room, a sea of unfamiliar faces greeted her. The officers sat in rows around a large rectangular table, their expressions ranging from guarded to openly dismissive. Jessica's eyes scanned the group quickly, noting the varied responses to her presence. A few nodded politely, others avoided her gaze entirely, and some leaned back in their chairs with arms crossed, a silent display of resistance. At the head of the table sat Deputy Chief William Hargrove, a man with graying hair and a meticulously pressed uniform. His piercing blue eyes met Jessica's with a look that was hard to read, a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Hargrove had been with the department for over 25 years, and it was no secret that many in Cedar View had expected him to take the helm after the previous chief retired. Jessica suspected that his quiet deference to her appointment wasn't entirely genuine. Chief Simpson, Hargrove said, rising from his seat and extending a hand. Welcome to Cedar View. Thank you, Deputy Chief Hargrove, Jessica replied, shaking his hand firmly. His grip was strong, but she matched it without hesitation. She wasn't here to play games. Taking her place at the head of the table, Jessica set down her leather-bound notebook and surveyed the room. She took her time, letting the silence linger just long enough to establish her presence. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but commanding. Good morning, everyone. I know that my appointment as chief has brought a mix of reactions. Some of you are excited, others are hesitant, and a few of you may be outright opposed to it. That's fine. I'm not here to demand your trust, I'm here to earn it. Her words hung in the air, meeting a room that remained eerily quiet. A few officers exchanged glances, their expressions a blend of surprise and unease. Jessica continued. Cedar View has a reputation, she said, her tone sharpening slightly. And it's not the kind of reputation any of us should be proud of. Reports of biased policing, lack of accountability, and mistrust between the department and the community are not just rumors, they're facts. And facts demand action. A man seated near the middle of the table shifted in his chair, his posture rigid. His nameplate read Sergeant Brian Whitaker. With his sharp jawline and crew-cut hair, he exuded an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. With all due respect, Chief, Whitaker interjected, his voice measured but unmistakably challenging, Cedar View isn't Chicago or New York. We don't have riots in the streets or gangs running our neighborhoods. The way we've done things here has worked for decades. Jessica turned her gaze to him, her expression neutral but her eyes unyielding. Has it worked, Sergeant? For whom? Because I've read the community reports, and I've seen the statistics. They tell a very different story. Whitaker opened his mouth to respond, but Jessica cut him off, her tone firm but not harsh. I'm not here to dismantle everything you've built, Sergeant. I'm here to strengthen it, to make sure this department serves everyone in Cedar View, not just a select few. The tension in the room was palpable, but Jessica refused to let it derail her. She shifted her focus to the larger group. I won't pretend this will be easy. Change never is. But I will tell you this, I'm not your enemy. I'm your ally, if you're willing to work with me. My door will always be open, and I'll always listen. But if you choose to resist reform or undermine this department's integrity, I promise you, I will act. A murmur rippled through the room, the weight of her words settling over the group like a heavy blanket. Jessica let the moment stretch, then pivoted. Now, let's talk specifics. I've reviewed the current protocols and noticed several areas where we can improve, starting with community outreach programs. This department hasn't held a single town hall in over 5 years. That's going to change. I expect a proposal for a quarterly community meeting on my desk by the end of the week. Jessica went on to outline her initial plans, touching on topics ranging from officer training to transparency in reporting. She didn't sugarcoat the challenges but emphasized the opportunities for growth. By the time the meeting ended, she could see the beginnings of something, respect, or perhaps just curiosity, in the faces of a few officers. As the room emptied, Hargrove lingered. He approached Jessica, his hands clasped behind his back. "You've got your work cut out for you, Chief," he said, his voice low. "This isn't the kind of department that changes overnight." "I'm not expecting overnight, Deputy Chief," Jessica replied, her tone resolute. "But I am expecting progress." Hargrove nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "We'll see," he said before walking away. Jessica remained in the conference room for a moment, letting the quiet envelop her. The weight of what lay ahead was immense, but she welcomed it. This wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Cedar View was a puzzle, its pieces scattered and uneven, but Jessica was determined to fit them together. The question was whether the department, and the town, would let her. Seeds of resistance. Jessica stared out of her office window at the Cedar View Police Department parking lot. The morning's tension lingered like a storm cloud, heavy and threatening. She watched as officers moved between their vehicles and the station, some with purpose, others idling in casual conversation. Though their uniforms were crisp and their movements efficient, Jessica couldn't help but feel the undercurrent of unease. This wasn't just a first-day jitters situation. This was resistance to her, her leadership, and what she represented. Her office, like the rest of the building, was functional but uninspired. The walls were bare except for a framed photograph of Cedar View from decades past, its streets filled with vintage cars and smiling townsfolk. Jessica made a mental note to bring in a few personal touches, photos of her family, perhaps a piece of art that reminded her of home. For now, though, the office was just another empty space waiting to be filled with purpose. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, turning away from the window. Deputy Chief William Hargrove stepped inside, his expression as unreadable as ever. He carried a folder under his arm, his movements deliberate and practiced. Hargrove was the embodiment of a career officer, steady, disciplined, and set in his ways. Jessica wasn't sure yet whether he would be an ally or an obstacle. "Chief," he began, placing the folder on her desk, "I thought you'd want to review the weekly incident reports. It'll give you a sense of what we're dealing with on the ground." Jessica nodded, taking the folder. "Thank you, Deputy Chief. I appreciate it." Hargrove didn't sit, instead lingering by the chair opposite her desk. "I also wanted to talk about the meeting this morning," he said, his tone measured. Jessica raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" Hargrove hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Your approach was direct. Some of the officers may feel that it's a bit too much, too soon. This department has a certain rhythm, a way of doing things. Change takes time." Jessica leaned back in her chair, meeting his gaze. "I understand that, but the issues we're dealing with here aren't the kind that can wait. If the officers are uncomfortable, that's something we'll address, but I won't soften my stance on accountability and fairness." Hargrove's expression remained neutral, but Jessica could see the tension in his jaw. "Fair enough," he said after a moment. "But I'd advise caution. This town, it's not as open to change as you might hope. Pushing too hard could backfire." "Noted," Jessica said, her tone even. "Anything else, Deputy Chief?" Hargrove shook his head. "No, ma'am. Just thought you should know where things stand." As he left, Jessica opened the folder and began flipping through the reports. Most of the incidents were routine, traffic violations, petty thefts, noise complaints. But buried among them were cases that caught her attention, multiple stops involving black residents for suspicious behavior, vague justifications for searches, and an alarming pattern of disproportionate citations in certain neighborhoods. The numbers painted a clear picture. Bias wasn't just an undercurrent in Cedarview, it was woven into the fabric of the department's operations. Jessica leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She needed to tackle this head-on, but she also needed to be strategic. If she alienated the officers too quickly, she risked losing their cooperation entirely. But if she moved too slowly, she would be complicit in the very system she had vowed to change. Later that afternoon, Jessica decided to take a walk through the station. She wanted to get a sense of the department's culture beyond the reports and formal meetings. As she passed the break room, she heard low voices coming from inside, punctuated by occasional laughter. She paused, debating whether to enter, then decided to step in. The room fell silent as soon as she crossed the threshold. Four officers were gathered around a small table, their coffee mugs halfway to their mouths. Among them were Sergeant Brian Whitaker and Officer Ryan Carter. Whitaker's eyes narrowed slightly, while Carter looked away, feigning interest in a poster on the wall about workplace safety. "Afternoon," Jessica said, her tone polite but firm. "Mind if I join you?" The officers exchanged glances, and Whitaker finally spoke. "Of course not, Chief. Take a seat." Jessica pulled out a chair and sat, her posture relaxed but her gaze sharp. "I thought I'd take a break from my office and get to know the team better. How's everyone doing today?" The question was met with awkward silence. Finally, one of the younger officers, a woman named Amy Klein, spoke up. "We're good, Chief. Just the usual stuff, paperwork, patrols, nothing too exciting." Jessica nodded, then turned her attention to Whitaker. "And you, Sergeant? How are you finding things today?" Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Same as always, Chief. Just trying to keep the wheels turning." Jessica smiled faintly. "I can appreciate that. I know change can be challenging, but I hope you'll see it as an opportunity rather than a disruption." Whitaker's smirk was subtle but unmistakable. "With all due respect, Chief, Cedarview's been doing fine for decades. Sometimes change isn't about fixing something broken, it's about someone wanting to leave their mark." Jessica met his gaze evenly. "Sometimes it's both, Sergeant. And as leaders, it's our job to recognize when the status quo isn't serving everyone equally." Whitaker didn't respond, but the tension in the room was palpable. Jessica decided not to press further, instead shifting the conversation to lighter topics. After a few minutes, the officers relaxed slightly, though the undercurrent of resistance remained. As the day wound down, Jessica returned to her office, her mind still buzzing with thoughts. She was reviewing a set of training schedules when her phone buzzed. The caller ID read unknown, but she picked up anyway. "Chief Simpson," she answered. A hesitant voice came through the line. "Chief, this is Mrs. Turner. I live on Willow Lane. I didn't know who else to call." Jessica's brow furrowed. "It's okay, Mrs. Turner. What's going on?" "There's been some trouble in the neighborhood," Mrs. Turner said, her voice trembling. "A couple of officers have been coming around, stopping kids, asking them questions, but it doesn't feel right. They're not doing it in other parts of town." Jessica's grip on the phone tightened. "Thank you for letting me know, Mrs. Turner. I'll look into it personally." As the call ended, Jessica felt a surge of anger. She had suspected this kind of behavior, but hearing it directly from a resident made it all the more real. She jotted down the details, already formulating a plan. This wasn't just about policy or training, it was about trust, about showing the community that things could and would change. Jessica leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The resistance within the department was real, and it wasn't going to disappear overnight. But she had made a promise to herself, and to Cedarview, that she wouldn't back down. If the seeds of resistance were being sown, she would be the one to uproot them. One step at a time. A crack in the shield. The sun dipped low over Cedarview, casting long shadows across the town streets as Jessica Simpson drove toward Willow Lane. The call from Mrs. Turner earlier in the day had stuck with her. There was something in the older woman's voice, fear mixed with resignation, that Jessica couldn't ignore. This wasn't a simple complaint. It was a cry for help, and Jessica intended to respond personally. If she was going to bridge the gap between the police and the community, she needed to show up, not as an authority figure behind a desk, but as someone willing to listen and act. Willow Lane was a modest stretch of homes, the kind that spoke of hard-working families making the best of what they had. Kids' bicycles leaned against fences, and laundry hung on lines strung between backyard trees. Yet the neighborhood bore signs of neglect, a pothole-filled street, faded paint on houses, and sidewalks cracked with weeds. Jessica parked her SUV near the curb, scanning the area. A few residents sat on porches, their eyes following her cautiously. She stepped out, making sure her movements were calm and deliberate. As she approached Mrs. Turner's home, a small bungalow with a neatly trimmed lawn, the door opened, and the elderly woman stepped out. Her gray hair was pulled back into a bun, and she clutched a cardigan around her shoulders despite the warmth of the evening. "Chief Simpson," Mrs. Turner said, her voice tentative but grateful. "Thank you for coming." "Of course, Mrs. Turner," Jessica replied, offering a reassuring smile. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me more about what's been happening?" Mrs. Turner led Jessica to her porch, where they sat on a pair of weathered wooden chairs. The older woman sighed deeply, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It started about a month ago," she said, her voice low. "The officers started patrolling more frequently. At first, I thought it was a good thing. But then they started stopping the kids, asking them questions like they'd done something wrong. These are just teenagers, Chief. My grandson Jeremiah was stopped twice last week, and he's only 15. Jessica frowned. "What were they questioning him about?" Mrs. Turner shook her head. "Nothing that made sense. They said he looked out of place, but he's lived here his whole life. It's not just him, either. Other parents have been telling me the same thing. They're scared, but they don't know who to trust. That's why I called you." Jessica nodded, her jaw tightening. She could feel the weight of Mrs. Turner's words, the years of mistrust that had built up between the police and the community. This wasn't just about individual incidents, it was about a systemic problem that had gone unaddressed for far too long. "Thank you for telling me," Jessica said, her tone firm but compassionate. "I'll speak with the officers involved and make sure this stops. And please, let the other parents know they can reach out to me directly. I want to hear from them." Mrs. Turner hesitated, then reached out and placed a hand on Jessica's arm. "I believe you, Chief. But a lot of folks around here, they've been let down before. It's going to take more than words to fix this." Jessica met her gaze, the determination in her eyes unwavering. "I understand, Mrs. Turner. And I promise you, this won't be ignored." The next morning, Jessica arrived at the station early. The reports from Mrs. Turner's neighborhood were already on her desk, along with a list of the officers assigned to the area. As she skimmed the documents, a pattern began to emerge: repeated stops of young black residents, vague justifications like suspicious behavior, and no tangible outcomes from any of the interactions. It was profiling, plain and simple. Jessica felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to stay focused. Anger wouldn't fix this. Action would. By mid-morning, she had summoned the officers responsible for the patrols, Ryan Carter and another junior officer, Paul Jenkins, to her office. Both men entered cautiously, their expressions a mix of confusion and unease. Jessica gestured for them to sit. "Officers," she began, her voice steady but firm, "I've received complaints from residents on Willow Lane about your recent patrols. Specifically, about the way you've been engaging with the neighborhood's youth. Carter shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting to Jenkins, who looked equally nervous. "Chief, we were just doing our job," Carter said, his tone defensive. "It's a high-crime area. We've been trying to prevent problems before they start." Jessica leaned forward, fixing him with a sharp gaze. "And how exactly do you define preventing problems, Officer Carter?" "By stopping teenagers and interrogating them without cause." Jenkins spoke up, his voice hesitant. We were following protocol, ma'am. If someone looks out of place." "Out of place?" Jessica interrupted, her tone cutting through his excuse. "What does that even mean, Officer Jenkins? Jeremiah Turner is a 15-year-old boy who's lived in that neighborhood his entire life. How exactly is he out of place?" The room fell silent, the weight of Jessica's words pressing down on the two officers. Carter opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. Jenkins stared at the floor. "This department will not tolerate profiling or harassment," Jessica continued, her voice cold with authority. "If you can't do your jobs without targeting people based on assumptions and biases, then you don't belong here." Carter's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Jenkins nodded meekly. "I'll be monitoring your patrols closely," Jessica added. "And I'll be implementing new training sessions on community engagement and bias awareness. Consider this your warning." The officers left her office, their tension palpable. Jessica leaned back in her chair, letting out a long breath. She knew this was just the beginning. Changing a culture so deeply ingrained wouldn't happen overnight, and there would undoubtedly be pushback. But she was ready for it. Later that afternoon, Jessica called a meeting with Deputy Chief Hargrove and the other senior staff. She outlined her plan to overhaul the department's community engagement strategy, focusing on rebuilding trust and fostering transparency. "We need to stop seeing certain neighborhoods as problem areas," Jessica said. "And we need to stop treating the residents as suspects. It's our job to protect and serve everyone in this town, not just a select few." Hargrove listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. When Jessica finished, he spoke up. "It's a good plan, Chief. But you're going to face resistance, both from the community and from some of the officers." "I'm prepared for that," Jessica replied. "But we can't keep operating the way we have been. This isn't just about doing what's right, it's about ensuring the long-term effectiveness of this department." Hargrove nodded slowly. "You've got my support, Chief. But we'll need to move carefully. Change is a process, not a sprint." Jessica appreciated his pragmatism, even if she wished for more urgency. "Understood, Deputy Chief. But make no mistake, change is coming." That evening, as Jessica sat at her desk reviewing more reports, she received an email from a resident. It was a simple message, thanking her for visiting Willow Lane and addressing the concerns of the community. The words were short but heartfelt, and they gave Jessica a small but meaningful sense of hope. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. There would be setbacks, conflicts, and moments of doubt. But for every Mrs. Turner, every teenager like Jeremiah, and every family in Cedar View that felt unseen and unheard, Jessica was determined to keep fighting. This wasn't just about reforming a police department. It was about reshaping a culture, one action, one conversation, one neighborhood at a time. The spark of defiance. The sound of muffled voices echoed down the hallway as Jessica Simpson walked toward the Cedar View Police Department's briefing room. It was an unseasonably chilly morning, and the air in the station felt heavy, not from the weather, but from the tension that had been growing since Jessica's arrival. Her reforms were beginning to take shape, new training sessions on bias awareness, mandatory community patrol rotations, and transparency protocols that required detailed reports on all stops. To some officers, these changes were welcome and overdue. To others, they were an attack on the old way of doing things, a way they weren't ready to let go of. Jessica pushed open the door to the briefing room, a large space with a whiteboard at the front and rows of chairs arranged in neat lines. About 24 officers were seated, their chatter halting the moment she entered. She could feel the weight of their stares, some openly defiant, others merely curious. She walked to the front of the room, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. "Good morning," Jessica began, her voice steady and clear. "I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the changes we're implementing and address any questions or concerns you might have." A murmur ran through the room, but no one spoke up immediately. Jessica waited, her gaze sweeping over the group, daring someone to take the lead. Finally, Sergeant Brian Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest. "With all due respect, Chief," he said, his tone bordering on condescension, "I think a lot of us are wondering the same thing: what exactly is the endgame here? Are we supposed to abandon the methods that have worked for years just because the town's unhappy with a few reports?" Jessica met his gaze without flinching. "The methods you're referring to aren't working, Sergeant. They're eroding trust in this department and alienating the very people we're supposed to serve." Whitaker smirked, his expression challenging. "And what about officer safety? These reforms might look good on paper, but out there," he gestured vaguely toward the station's windows, "it's a different story. We need to be able to do our jobs without second-guessing every decision." Jessica nodded slowly, letting his words hang in the air before responding. "Officer safety is a priority, and I will always support you when you act in good faith. But let's be clear, doing your job doesn't mean trampling on people's rights. If you can't distinguish between the two, then we have a bigger problem than I thought." A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Whitaker's smirk faded, but he didn't back down. "We're just saying, Chief, that you're changing too much too fast. Maybe you should spend more time getting to know this town before you decide how to run things." Jessica took a step forward, her voice firm but measured. "I don't need to spend months watching the damage unfold to know it's unacceptable. I've seen enough already, both in the numbers and in the stories from the community. Change is hard, I get that. But it's necessary. And it's happening." The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Jessica looked around, meeting the eyes of each officer in turn. "This isn't a debate. This is our new direction. If anyone has a problem with that, my door is always open. But I expect you to bring solutions, not excuses." After the meeting, Jessica returned to her office, the echo of Whitaker's defiance still ringing in her ears. She wasn't surprised by his resistance, she had anticipated pushback from the more entrenched members of the department. But his words carried a weight that she couldn't ignore. There was an undercurrent of unrest among some officers, a sense of rebellion simmering just below the surface. Jessica had barely settled at her desk when Deputy Chief William Hargrove appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Got a minute, Chief?" he asked. Jessica gestured for him to sit. "What's on your mind, Hargrove?" He closed the door behind him before sitting down, leaning slightly forward. "That meeting this morning. I don't think Whitaker's comments were just about him." Jessica folded her hands on the desk, her gaze steady. "I figured as much. What are you hearing?" Hargrove sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "There's talk. Some of the officers, especially the veterans, they feel like you're coming in too strong, trying to change everything overnight. Whitaker's got their ear, and he's not shy about voicing his opinions." Jessica's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to appease them, Hargrove. I'm here to do what's right. If they don't like it, that's their problem." "I agree with you," Hargrove said, his tone cautious. "But you should know that resistance like this doesn't just disappear. It builds. If Whitaker's pushing back in public, you can bet he's stirring the pot in private." Jessica leaned back in her chair, considering his words. "Do you think it's serious enough to undermine the work we're doing?" Hargrove hesitated, then nodded. "It could be. Whitaker's got a lot of influence in this department, and some of the younger officers look up to him. If he decides to dig his heels in, he could take a lot of people with him. Jessica exhaled slowly, her mind racing. She had faced resistance before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about one officer's defiance, it was about a culture that had been allowed to fester for years. Changing it would take more than new policies and training sessions. It would take grit, strategy, and allies. That afternoon, Jessica decided to visit one of the community centers on the south side of town. It was a modest building, painted a cheerful shade of blue, with children's laughter spilling out from the playground in the back. Jessica had reached out to the director, a woman named Evelyn Hart, earlier in the week to arrange a meeting. Evelyn greeted her warmly at the door. She was in her late 40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and an energy that seemed to fill the room. "Chief Simpson," she said, shaking Jessica's hand. "Thanks for coming. We've been hearing a lot about you." "Good things, I hope," Jessica replied with a small smile. Evelyn laughed. "Mostly. But I'm glad you're here. The community needs to see that you're serious about making a difference." They sat in Evelyn's office, a small room cluttered with papers and posters promoting after-school programs. Evelyn wasted no time diving into the challenges the community faced: lack of trust in the police, fear of retaliation for speaking out, and the toll that constant surveillance and profiling had taken on families. Jessica listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. This wasn't just about gathering information, it was about building a relationship. She knew that if she wanted the community to believe in her, she had to show them that she was willing to listen and learn. By the time the meeting ended, Jessica felt a renewed sense of purpose. Evelyn had invited her to attend an upcoming town hall meeting, and Jessica had eagerly accepted. It was an opportunity to speak directly to the people of Cedarview, to address their concerns and begin repairing the broken trust. As Jessica drove back to the station, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from an anonymous sender, the subject line reading, "You should watch this." Curious, she opened the message. It contained a link to a video, along with a short note, "This is what's happening behind your back." Jessica clicked the link, her stomach tightening as the video began to play. It was footage from the station's break room, recorded on someone's phone. The angle was shaky, but the audio was clear. In the video, Whitaker was speaking to a group of officers, his tone low but intense. "We've got to stick together," he was saying. "She's trying to tear this department apart, and if we let her, she'll ruin everything we've built. We don't have to take this lying down." The video ended, leaving Jessica staring at the screen in silence. Her jaw tightened, and a fire ignited in her chest. This wasn't just resistance, it was open defiance. And it couldn't go unchecked. As she pulled into the station parking lot, Jessica's mind was already racing with a plan. Whitaker wanted a fight, and she wasn't about to back down. If he thought he could undermine her leadership, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. A reckoning. Jessica sat at her desk, her laptop glowing in the dim light of her office. The video of Sergeant Brian Whitaker's meeting with the officers played on repeat, each frame etching itself deeper into her mind. His words weren't just defiant, they were incendiary, a rallying cry to resist her authority and undermine the reforms she was working tirelessly to implement. She stopped the playback and leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her lips. If Whitaker wanted a confrontation, she would meet him head-on, but not without strategy. By the next morning, Jessica had crafted a plan. It wasn't just about confronting Whitaker, it was about sending a clear message to the entire department. Defiance would not be tolerated, but collaboration would be rewarded. She called Deputy Chief Hargrove into her office first, laying out the situation and her strategy. "We can't let this fester," she said, handing him a transcript of the video. "If we let his rhetoric spread unchecked, we'll lose the department. I need your support on this, Hargrove." Hargrove scanned the document, his face tightening with every line. "You've got it, Chief. But this isn't going to be easy. Whitaker's got friends, and they're loyal. Jessica nodded. Loyalty's fine, so long as it doesn't cross the line into insubordination. He's free to have his opinions, but the moment he tries to incite rebellion, he crosses that line. And I won't tolerate it. Hargrove leaned forward, his tone serious. What's your move? Jessica's lips pressed into a thin line. We bring him in. I want him to see that we know exactly what he's doing. But more importantly, I want the rest of the department to see what accountability looks like. This isn't just about him, it's about setting a precedent. By mid-morning, the department buzzed with tension. Jessica had called a mandatory all-staff meeting, and word had spread quickly. Officers milled about in the hallway outside the briefing room, whispering in clusters. Some speculated it was another training initiative, others feared disciplinary action. Inside the briefing room, Jessica stood at the front, her posture composed and commanding. Hargrove stood off to the side, arms crossed, his expression stern. As the officers filed in, Jessica noted the range of emotions on their faces: curiosity, skepticism, unease. Whitaker entered last, his stride confident, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of wariness. He took a seat near the back, leaning back in his chair with an air of defiance. When the room had settled, Jessica stepped forward. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice firm but calm. This meeting is about more than policies and procedures. It's about integrity, yours, mine, and this department's. She let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. Recently, it's come to my attention that some within this department have taken issue with the changes we've been implementing. That's understandable. Change is difficult, and it's natural to have concerns. But there's a difference between expressing concerns constructively and undermining the very foundation of this department. Jessica paused, her gaze sweeping the room, locking onto Whitaker's for a brief second. I received a video, she said, her voice steady but sharp. A video of a meeting that took place right here, in this building. In that meeting, one of our own encouraged others to resist the reforms meant to improve how we serve this community. That behavior is unacceptable. A murmur rippled through the room, officers exchanging uneasy glances. Whitaker shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Jessica gestured to the back of the room, where a technician stood at the ready. I want you all to see this for yourselves. The video began to play on the projector screen, the shaky footage filling the room with Whitaker's voice. We don't have to take this lying down. She's trying to tear this department apart. The officers watched in stunned silence, the weight of the words sinking in. When the video ended, the room was so quiet that Jessica could hear her own heartbeat. She turned to face the group, her expression resolute. This department cannot function without trust, trust between us, and trust from the community. When one of us works against that trust, it jeopardizes everything we stand for. Jessica's gaze shifted to Whitaker, who now sat rigid in his chair, his expression a mix of anger and defiance. Sergeant Whitaker, she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, would you like to explain yourself? Whitaker stood, his posture stiff but his tone controlled. Chief, with all due respect, I was expressing my opinion. Last I checked, we were still allowed to have those. Jessica stepped closer, her eyes locked onto his. Having an opinion is one thing, Sergeant. Encouraging others to defy leadership and resist reforms designed to improve this department is another. Your actions go beyond opinion, they undermine the integrity of this team. Whitaker's mouth opened as if to argue, but Jessica didn't give him the chance. You've crossed a line, Sergeant. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a formal investigation. Turn in your badge and weapon to Deputy Chief Hargrove. A collective gasp filled the room, and Whitaker's face flushed with anger. You can't be serious, he said, his voice rising. I've been with this department for 20 years, and you're going to throw me under the bus because I don't agree with you? Jessica's voice remained calm but unyielding. This isn't about disagreement, Sergeant. This is about conduct. You're free to have your opinions, but you're not free to incite rebellion within the ranks. That's not leadership, it's sabotage. Whitaker hesitated, then slowly unbuckled his duty belt and placed it on the table. The sound of his badge hitting the surface was deafening. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Jessica turned back to the remaining officers, her tone softer but no less firm. This isn't about punishing dissent. It's about ensuring that this department operates with integrity and unity. If you have concerns, bring them to me. My door is always open. But I will not tolerate actions that divide us or harm the people we're here to serve. She let her words sink in before continuing. This is a turning point for Cedar View PD. We can either rise to meet the challenge of change, or we can fall apart. The choice is yours. Later that evening, Jessica sat in her office, staring at the city lights twinkling outside her window. The events of the day had left her drained but resolute. The suspension of Whitaker would send shockwaves through the department, but it was a necessary step. She knew the road ahead would still be fraught with challenges, but for the first time, she felt that progress was within reach. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she picked it up to find a text from Evelyn Hart, the community center director. Heard about what you did today. The community's talking, and they're starting to believe. Keep going, Chief. Jessica smiled faintly, the weight on her shoulders feeling just a little lighter. She had made her stand, and now it was up to the department, and the town, to follow her lead. The reckoning had begun, and there was no turning back.